Msgr, Michael Nazir-Ali, Catholic Ordinate with Peter Jacob, Center of Social Justice. Monsignor Michael James Nazir-Ali is a Pakistan-born British Roman Catholic priest and former Anglican bishop who served as the 106th Bishop of Rochester from 1994 to 2009, and before that as Bishop of Raiwan in Pakistan. He is currently the director of the Oxford Center for Training, Research, Advocacy and Dialogue in 2021. He was received into the Catholic Church and was ordained as a priest for the Ordinate of Our Lady of Walsingham. Peter Jacob is the executive director of the Center for Social Justice. He is a human rights professional, researcher, freelancer, journal, and trainer. He has been contributing articles for the News International, Daily Time, and the Friday Time. He has been associated with several national and international human rights organized since 1988 in different capacities, including Amnesty International Pakistan, Hotline Asia, Foreman Asia, and Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. He worked for Justice and Peace Commission Assistant and Acting Executive Secretary 1988-1990, the Pastoral Institute Multan as Lecturer and Executive Staff 1990-1995, and National Commission for Justice and Peace as its Executive Director 1995 and 2013. He researched authored Working Condition of Agricultural Labor in Pakistan in 2001 and Life on Migrants 2012, a study on situation of minority women in Punjab and Sindh province. He published several fact-finding reports and books in Urdu, including Insani Hukuk Ki Irtiqa and Insani Hukuk Ka Bainul Aqwami Nizam. He studies political science, law, and rural development in Pakistan and earned an LLM degree from University of Notre Dame in International Human Rights Law in 2014. We welcome our guest. Please start.
Gee, so I've got a few slides that I want to hang my talk on. I think the first one, if you could kindly put it up. Haji, this is the reason I've put this up is that I've been conscious as I go around the world that there are traditions of tolerance in many religious and cultural contexts in our world, and we will talk about some of them. And yet we find, in spite of these traditions of tolerance, that there is intolerance and prejudice and extremism in many different contexts. And the question is why this is so. So this, you will see, is the cylinder of Cyrus. Cyrus was the emperor of Persia in the 6th century BC. And one of the things that he did when he became emperor, not just of Persia, but also of Mesopotamia, was to issue this decree of religious freedom. In the 6th century BC, we are talking about, that's 2,600 years ago, which allowed religious freedom in his domains. But also, one of the things that is recorded in the Bible is that he allowed the people of Israel to return to their home from exile in Babylon, in what is now Iraq. So I happened to be in Tehran when this cylinder, which is usually in the British Museum, had been loaned to the National Museum of Tehran. And I was talking to some scholars and government representatives in Iran, and I said, what a great tradition of tolerance Iran has, mentioning this cylinder of Cyrus. And the leader of their delegation said to me, he said, we are not so interested in the past, we are interested in the future. Now, well, okay, I understand what he's saying, but if you don't understand your past, how are you going to make a future? So it is very important for us to understand our past. Okay, the next slide, please. Anyone? These are the pillars of Ashoka, the Emperor Ashoka of India, from the 3rd century BC. Ashoka was a great conqueror. He was one of the first people to unite the subcontinent. by his conquests. But then he became a Buddhist and ceased all his army expeditions, became a man of peace, and he erected these pillars all over the subcontinent, basically proclaiming tolerance for all kinds of religious beliefs. So the question is, if Buddhism leads people to this kind of tolerance of other people, then we have the situation nowadays, for example, in Myanmar and Burma, where both Muslims and Christians are suffering from Buddhist extremism. So why is that the case? Why don't people learn the lesson? And why is the Rohingya situation or the Chin situation so active in a place like Burma or Myanmar? Okay, the next slide, please. This is the Emperor Constantine. You remember Christians were persecuted in the Roman Empire for many centuries. But then when Constantine became emperor, because of an experience that he'd had of the cross, he issued this thing. This is not the Edict of Milan, by the way. If you can read Greek, you will see this is the Nicene Creed. But he issued the Edict of Milan. Now, it is often thought that this was to recognize Christianity now as the official faith of the Roman Empire. But it was not just about that. It was actually a decree of religious freedom for everyone, including the pagan religions of beliefs of Rome and of its empire at that time, and there were many such. The parallel to the Edict of Milan about maybe 60 years later was something called the Edict of Yazdegerd in Iran, which instituted the millet system for the Jewish and the Christian populations of Persia at that time, which actually then became the basis when Islam came to Iran and to other parts in that area. It became the basis of what is known as the millet system, by which different religious communities were organized. The next one, please. You know what this is? Our former Prime Minister used to talk about it quite a lot. This is Sahifat al-Medina. This is the Constitution of Medina promulgated by the Prophet of Islam when he became the ruler of that part, which recognized and prescribed equal participation and rights for Muslims and for non-Muslims in Medina at that time. So when people say to me that they want an Islamic state in here or there, I say to them, will it be like this one? And if not, why not? So again, there is a tradition of tolerance here that can be used to promote harmony and freedom. Okay, the next one, please. This is Magna Carta, promulgated in England, reluctantly by the king. And to this we trace many of the fundamental freedoms that are enshrined in law. Of course, in English law, but because of the influence of the British Empire in law in many different parts of the world. And Magna Carta also has a prehistory. So there were the laws of King Alfred, who first united the different kingdoms in England. There was the Charter of Liberties, and then there was Magna Carta. And following Magna Carta, there was the Bill of Rights of 1689. Important milestones. Okay, the next one, please. Do you know where that is? Ji? Anyone recognize that? It's outside the United Nations. And this is an allusion to the biblical metaphor of beating your swords into plowshares. That is what this man is doing. So it's again a declaration of harmony and peace and tolerance right outside the United Nations building. Now, the question is, given that there are these traditions of tolerance, we've seen this with Cyrus, we've seen this with Ashoka, we have seen it with Constantine and the Edict of Milan, we have seen it in the Sahifat al-Madina, we've seen it in Magna Carta and in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Why, given this rich tradition of tolerance and freedom, why is tolerance and freedom abused then in so many parts of the world? And there are different reasons for this. So the next slide, please. This is a family in Eritrea. And the reason for the persecution of Muslims and Christians in Eritrea is simple tyranny. It's a one-man rule, and anyone who challenges this one man gets into trouble. So, and these people suffer terribly. Whether they are this is a Christian family, but there could be others also. They are imprisoned in containers and left outside in the desert, in the heat and then the cold of the desert. They are beaten, tortured even for singing hymns. So this is one reason for the abuse of freedom is just tyranny. Zulm, जिसे हम कहते हैं. Of course, it's not the only reason. The next slide, please. This is the situation in China. China is a friend of this country, of course. And China has, although it is an atheist state, officially, it has very large Christian and Muslim and Buddhist populations. But all of them are under pressure. So Muslims and Christians cannot teach their children their faith, for example. How will the faith be passed on if people cannot teach their children the faith? We have heard about the situation of the Uyghur people in China, very near, of course, this country itself. These people are regularly arrested, exiled, their churches and mosques are demolished, they are put to forced labor. And we have to ask what the reason is, and the reason, of course, is ideology. So this time it is not tyranny, but ideology. And in this case, it is communist ideology, but it could be something else, of course. We could have a fascist ideology. That also has been troublesome for freedom of people's conscience and freedom of belief. But in our experience, at least in my generation, communism has tried to wipe out faith of any kind. So a few years ago, I had the chance to go to Albania, to Tirana, and when we were approaching the airport, the air hostess said, you know how they make an announcement, we are now approaching Mother Teresa International Airport. Now this is a miracle, because Albania was a country that had openly said it was going to abolish religion, wipe out religion altogether. But they have not succeeded. Again, Christian and Muslim populations are flourishing in Albania. But communism remains a threat also in Vietnam and Laos and some other parts of the world. It's an ideological threat. Okay, next one, please. This is also an ideological threat. This is the idea, Hindutva, that is to say that to be a proper Indian, you have to be a Hindu in some form or other. And that has huge implications for the many millions of Muslims and Christians living in India. I mean, of course, in one sense, the term Hindu simply means Indian. It means one who lives by Darya-e-Hind. Darya-e-Hind is, of course, only in Pakistan. But that is what it means. So, but if it means something religious, then questions about freedom arise. So this is an example not of ideology like communism, but of nationalist ideology that has a religious tinge to it. Now, a Christian version of this I saw in Serbia and Bosnia during the conflict there. So it can have a Christian version, it can have a Hindu version, it can have a Muslim version, and so on. But once again, very often these ideologies try to repress the freedom of other people, cultural, religious, literary, and so on. I mean, we can talk about this later, but it is a worrying trend, and it is basically a rejection in India itself of its Gandhian tradition. It's an open rejection of that. The next one, please. Now, this is another kind of extremism. This is in the Holy Land. That Jewish extremism, of course, the Jewish people have suffered in many different parts of the world, and we have to be conscious of their suffering. But that does not give them the right to inflict suffering on other people. We've just had Christmas, and what town do we remember especially at Christmas? I think most people will know that. Bethlehem, of course. Well, in my lifetime, the population of Bethlehem has gone from being 80% Christian to being 20% Christian. And the reason is Israeli government policies about mobility of the Palestinian people, and also Islamist extremism. So they have been caught in the middle. Again, this is nationalism related to religion in a particular way. Okay, next one, please. And this is Our Lady of Salvation Church in Baghdad after the bombing. And this is Malula. Malula is an area in Syria where they still speak as their mother tongue the language of Jesus, Aramaic. There are very few places left like that in Iraq and Syria. I have been to Malula, I have seen this myself, and this is, again, destruction in the name of extremism, of religious extremism. Much of this is now being rebuilt. This was a bombing carried out, this is before Daesh, this is before the coming of so-called Islamic State. This was actually carried out by an Al-Qaeda related body during Mass, and scores of people were killed in this bombing, and this picture was taken very soon after the bombing. You can see all of the results. So this is another kind of extremism that we find that denies people their God-given right to freedom of belief. Okay? Okay, let's hold that for a while. The reasons we have seen for this extremism, what is to be done about it? I mean, that is the question. This, by the way, before I go on, this is now the denial of religious freedom in the West. So, in Britain, for example, there's been a long tradition of respecting conscience. Even in terms of conflict, of war, people who don't want to fight are given the option not to fight but to do something else to help the nation. The laws that made abortion legal in Britain, I'm not a fan of them, obviously, but even those laws recognized that people could opt out on grounds of religion or belief if they did not want to participate in such a task. But we find now that conscience is being denied in new legislation. whether it is a so-called hate speech legislation, people's conscience and their freedom of speech is not being recognized, or whether it is related to family and marriage, questions like that, the nature of family and marriage. We have to ask why this is happening. Why is the West giving up its long tradition of respecting conscience, which was, of course, based on the idea that human beings are made in God's image and they have a dignity which has to be respected. But it is widely now being denied. One of the things that I want to say with respect to each of these elements that we've seen is that democracy is very dangerous. See, I mean, I'm sure we all here believe in democracy, but democracy on its own is dangerous because it can simply become a tyranny of the majority. You see, and tyranny of the majority is no less a tyranny than any other kind of tyranny. So this is why democracy always has to be balanced by, well, whatever you want to call these things, but let's call it a Bill of Rights, you see. So a Bill of Rights, for instance, would enshrine values like one law for all, you see, equality of all before the law, refusal to discriminate against people on grounds of religion or belief. Those sorts of things are fundamental. Now, the situation in Egypt, for example, these days is very fluid, and there are many aspects that are of concern to human rights activists. But the new, well, it's not so new now, the newish Egyptian constitution does incorporate some elements of a Bill of Rights, which enshrines to some extent freedom of worship, freedom to build places of worship, and so on. And the appointment of a Christian Chief Justice of the Egyptian Supreme Court, I mean, this was unthinkable even 10 years ago, is a sign of this greater recognition. So I would say that in any situation, democracy has to be complemented by an appropriate Bill of Rights. We can discuss this, if you like, in a moment. Respect for conscience, coming back to this, and in other contexts also, of course, respect for conscience, not just in what is known as the internal forum, that is to say, what we believe in our own minds and hearts, but respect for conscience in public expression of our beliefs. So, public manifestation of belief. The United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, Article 18, says that people should have a right to freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of belief, and the right to manifest their belief publicly and privately, individually, or together as a community. I mean, all of these things are very important. So conscience, manifestation of our beliefs, and also, as we saw earlier, the importance of parents being the primary carers of their children. You see, the communists, of course, have always threatened this, whether in the old Soviet Union or even now in China. But the United Nations Rights of the Child recognizes that parents are the primary carers and educators of their children. The state is, strictly speaking, ancillary. The state has a role to support parents, not to take over what belongs fundamentally to parents in bringing up their children. In the West these days, this is being widely denied. because the state is taking over from the parents and is sometimes removing parents from the care of their own children. I think we have to watch these developments also in other parts of the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have seen that there are traditions of tolerance in many different cultural and religious contexts, and we can use these as a resource for our own work. But we've also seen that in spite of these traditions of tolerance in cultures and religious contexts, that these are widely denied, and freedom of belief, freedom of expression is abused and repressed. So, and then we have seen what we can do about it in terms of a Bill of Rights, of respect for conscience, of respect for manifestation of religious belief, and for reasonable accommodation in the public place and also in the workplace. So that reasonable accommodation means that at the workplace or elsewhere in public, that employers have an obligation, and other agencies, to make sure there's religious freedom of expression and manifestation of belief where they have responsibility, provided their work is not harmed in any way. And that means giving people the opportunity to pray, for instance, at their place of work at a suitable time, for religious holidays, for instance, and also for people to express their belief in terms of what they wear, for instance. So those were the sorts of things I wanted to say. I know that Mr. Peter Jacob is now going to respond with his own long experience of upholding these freedoms in this country.
Thank you so much, Monsignor Michael Nazir-Ali, for broadening our spectrum of discussion this evening, because many a times we are just caught up with our own issues in Pakistan, and the media keeps us busy thinking about what will happen this evening and tomorrow. At the moment, we don't have a government in Punjab. So those happenings. But for people who joined later and could not listen to the introduction by our host, Monsignor Michael has been, very supportive, and he has been studying and teaching faith to the faithful here in Pakistan and all over the world, wherever he goes for lectures, in the universities, in academic institutions, in the places of worship. He has also supported educational institutions from Pakistan, from FC College to Oxford, and from Diocese of Rye to Rochester. The letter R becomes very important here. So thank you so much, Monsignor Michael. Well, we will have perhaps some questions from the audience also very young audience that we have this evening. But one question that I would like to start with is that your experience, your own Pakistan, do you think the question of religious freedom, although we have it in the Constitution of Pakistan, we have it in the discussions, but we talk about religion a lot, and religion and politics more than that. But do you think we have placed a serious emphasis so far on the question of religious freedom, the very nuance of it? For instance, when we study human rights and we try to find the fundamentals or the foundations of human rights, we look at different values, religious values as well as human values like equality, justice. and peaceful coexistence. And then we importantly look at the question of human dignity, which is explained as inherent for a human being to have the human dignity. It is unquestionable. It is without any condition that you attach a dignity to every human person as a fundamental of human rights. But then the question, why this dignity? Why this is unconditional? Humans do a lot of things which are unlikable. So why that dignity presumption? Similarly, I don't see many of those discussions in connection with religious freedom, especially for the young lot who have seen a lot of things happening, a lot of bad things happening in the name of religion, in the politics, and of course, normal human life. So, do you think we have absorbed that concept of religious freedom, and which is basically mutual freedom, individual as well as mutual? So, do you think we need some emphasis on this, and if at all that happens, what should be the framework that you would suggest? And also, if you can comment on why there isn't that deep, that serious discussion around religious freedom in Pakistan. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. I mean, one of the things that I say to people, friends of many different religions, that if somebody criticizes your faith, answer them. Don't shut them down. That is not the way. If they say something about your faith that you feel is wrong or misunderstood or even offensive, then give them an answer. So the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, Article 18, which talks about freedom not just of belief, but of speech, of thought and speech, and that includes writing and so on. There is no point having such a freedom if no one is going to be offended by what you say. You see, I mean, if you are freely expressing yourself, then it is possible that you may offend somebody. That is the whole point about freedom of expression. So this is a very precious freedom. With Pakistan, what is the situation here? It depends what you compare it to, sir. So Iran, I know Iran very well as a nation. Compared to Iran, there is quite a lot of freedom, certainly for worship and for community life, for people of different faiths in this country, comparatively speaking. But if you compare it to some other countries, then there isn't as much. One of the things that I have just said is the importance of a Bill of Rights, which enshrines one law for all. I mean, if you don't have one law for everybody, whatever their belief or lack of belief, then freedoms of different kinds are imperiled. So I would say that the first step to increase freedom, not just of belief, but of expression, of thought and expression, is some kind of Bill of Rights provision.
Nabila has raised her hand before anyone. Nabila, you want to ask a question? I think we must allow that, you see, rather than me speaking. Please go ahead.
Bishop, I have a question that if you are talking about Bill of Rights, if we speak in international terms, Bill of Rights is UDHR, Convention on Civil and Political Rights, Convention on Social and Cultural Rights. So if any country that's member of UNO, like Pakistan, we ratified it in 2008, Convention on Civil and Political Rights. So, are you talking about specifically these three documents? Like in democracy, we have to take guidelines from these three documents, or you are saying like generally a country should have make his own Bill of Rights?
Well, I mean, I'm not against a Bill of Rights that is contextual, but it must take these fundamental documents into account. For instance, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights that you've just mentioned, that enshrines freedom of thought and speech, limited only if there is a physical threat to another individual or community, or if there's a threat of discrimination against an individual or a community. Those are the only limits. Where the United Nations Declaration is concerned, and other such declarations, we also have the European Convention, that has to be an absolute commitment. You cannot put riders on it to say, we are limited by this or that consideration. Now, Pakistan, its foreign minister at that time, when the declaration was being formed in 1948, Sir Zafarullah Khan played a leading role in the formation of this declaration, as did the Lebanese politician Charles Malik. Both of these people were fully cognizant of diverse religious communities in their countries. And I would have said, yes, that the limits that are recognized already in the declarations or in the covenants should be respected. But if you start entering codicils of different kinds, of reservations of different kinds, then of course the end result is a negation of these declarations.
Yes. Kindly introduce yourself and use microphone if you want.
Hello, sir. My name is Hareem. I wanted to ask you, what do you think the future of Pakistan is heading towards? Because it's not just when it comes to religious extremism, it's not just some politicians abusing it for power anymore. It's ingrained in the minds of the majority, especially youth. So it's only going to pass on to next generation and the next generation. I'm very pessimistic when it comes to like future of religious freedom in Pakistan. Even though we seldomly have good politicians in Pakistan who actually want to do reformations in that regard. Even if we have one in the utopian world, even if we have a good politician like Salman Taseer was, even if a politician talks about abolishing or even the slight misuse of blasphemy law, or if they talk about making Pakistan a more secular nation, I'm sure they'll be killed in like seconds. So what do you think about that? Where are we heading? What's the future?
Would you like to say something?
Okay. Sorry, I missed hearing your name. Hareem. Thank you so much, Hareem. Yes, in fact, I would also like to hear from Msgr Michael, but personally, as someone who's been trying to gather data, analyze situation, offer some solutions, talk to the decision makers. Yes, it's a prevailing sentiment. I must say it's a very common sentiment, and the youth here need to know that in fact Pakistan is very special experiment on the face of earth. There is nothing that is exactly comparable to Pakistan. Perhaps Israel, perhaps India in some way. We were always in a very special situation, and therefore the fight against what you call extremism became hard, as from the very outset some of the decisions which were made for the country have made it difficult in the internal and external policies. I mean, look at past 4 years, for instance, our external policy with Afghanistan has turned into a policy nightmare. Basically, I mean, anyone could have think what is going to happen to Pakistan if we allow the situation to develop in that way. And unfortunately, we were part of those discussions. The settlements, the agreements which were being signed between US and Afghanistan and the talks, and we were part of it, unfortunately, and we did not use that opportunity to basically apprehend and place some conditions on that. So, I mean, we are there again where we were like 10 years ago. So what to do? That is that can be very depressing. But at the same time, what I do is I do a SWOT analysis every day, I must say. Looking at what is in the situation that can enable a favorable change, and what is it that will not. So in my work, I will invite you to look at the website of Center for Social Justice, and you'll know some of the work that I have been engaged. That gives me a hope. So we are not hoping against hope, hoping that we can't do anything else. We can only hope. Our analysis, optimism, if it is derived from the analysis itself, can provide us a way forward, at least a step forward, where we will be closer to a solution rather than staying in the quagmire of problems. So that is it. I think if we take a step and in the right direction, we will be closer to a solution. We will be closer to solving the problems. That has been. We don't have. I mean, in my age at least, we don't have a choice to do anything else. That's not about optimism, but I think an analysis-based optimism is what can keep you from mental and physical sicknesses. I mean, if at all, because sometimes sickness is natural and it is just to be born. But then to fight that sickness better, if we have our analysis in place, most of the time what happens is that our tools of analysis are wrong. Sometimes we misapply them, misapplication of one set of tools on another situation is something that brings us closer to pessimism. And but that is not unnatural. That is also natural, because that's a phase that you must face in life sometimes, as much as sufferings imposed by the situation, the external factors. I would not say that pessimism is something that you can't overcome. I think you can actually overcome that pessimism, and the life goes on. Even though that you see that situation imposed by climate change, for instance, is very big, and one feels helpless sometimes. But if you look at the solutions that people have worked out, amazing, I must say. Who could tell us that we can have different forms of batteries and how much we can save on wastage and other things? So I think there are solutions out there. We can even build a better world that will have to be based on the existing one. Sorry. Mr.
Yes, I have got it. Yeah, I have been impressed with the different religious leaders of the world that have been in history, different aspects of them. So, for instance, the teaching of Jesus on love, or the Buddha's detachment from material goods, and things like that. And one of the things that's impressed me about the Prophet of Islam is that he forgave those who insulted him. And so I think those who follow him have to ask this question of themselves, because it is incumbent on them to follow his practice. Of course, we can say some technical things about how the misuse of the blasphemy laws can be prevented. There are some administrative measures that can be taken. I've been commending them to successive governments here for many years. But the fundamental question is, whose practice are you looking at and whose practice are you following about this matter? I think one point that has to be made is that of education. I think we have basically, as a nation, failed our young people in education. We have not allocated enough resources for education. We have not provided them with an all-round education. We sometimes mistake indoctrination for education. I mean, all of those things. And we can learn lessons from different parts of the world about education. But an approach to education that is known as liberal education, by which I don't mean a political stance, but to make sure that people are not educated just in their own discipline. You see, I mean, you will know that many leaders of extremism are actually technocrats. So they've just been educated in their own discipline, and they regard everything else as dealable with manuals. But that is not what life is like. Life is much more complex than that. So I think if certainly at secondary and tertiary levels, if we can introduce the idea of a liberal education, that yes, you have to, in the end, you have to specialize in something, but you must also know about the rest of the world and other disciplines and how they impinge on life. Increasing literacy is very important, because through literacy people access information. You see, there's no use having highly technical modes of information available if people can't read, or if they are innumerate. So the one thing for optimism would be a surge in literacy at a very basic level, and in a liberal approach to education. I think that would transform things. But again, you see, pessimism and optimism, these are relative terms. So if you look, let's look at the chaos. I've just come from Karachi, where they're having local elections. There's absolute chaos going on. But the fact that the chaos can happen is also a positive thing. You see, I mean, our political scene looks chaotic, but that's because it is a real political scene. If there was a dictatorship, you wouldn't have this confusion and chaos. You see, you would just have one man rule or one party rule, and it would be very orderly, but it wouldn't be democratic, it wouldn't be real. We have the courts. I know the problems that we have with the courts, but in the end, I'm not saying this is justified, but in the end, Asia Bibi was acquitted by our own courts. You see, so that to have an independent judiciary is very important. We have, you may say, we have a press that is too free. I don't know if there are journalists present, there are some. But I was interviewed in an authoritarian country by a very competent journalist, and I thought, well, this is a very good interview. The next day when it was published, it was the opposite of everything I'd said. You see. So a free press is something to really to be valued and can bring about positive change in the country by promoting good values. So I think those are things that we should be optimistic about, and to preserve these things and to strengthen them. And then, of course, there is personal attitude. Every country has problems, but if people constantly run down their own country, then it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If everybody is running it down, it will get run down. So let's look at what can be done positively and contribute to the extent that we are able.
Yes, Abraham.
Thank you, Monsieur. My name is Abraham Murad. I'm one of the organizers here. I had a quick question. I really appreciated your presentation here about the rich heritage that we have in all religions for tolerance. I was wondering if you could perhaps give us some examples. We are in a Muslim majority country. You're a Catholic priest of perhaps examples in South Asia, and because you've worked all across the world, of good examples where they have come together in acts of kindness and tolerance, or perhaps from which we could learn from. Thank you.
Well, I gave you the example of Egypt. I think this is an example that must be looked at more closely. It's not without flaws, but it is 2,000 churches have been built in Egypt or extended in the last 10 to 15 years. This is more than has ever been the case in history. So you have to ask why. Why is this the case? When I was Bishop of Raiwan, we were given a plot of land in quite a nice part of Lahore. And the people who lived there came to me and said, please don't build a church here. So I said, well, what shall I do with the land? So they said, well, build a school. We'll send our children to your school, but don't build a church. So why not? I mean, what's the question? So we can learn from these experiences. I have seen myself with my own eyes the way in which the people of northern Iraq, of Kurdistan, gave refuge to hundreds of thousands of Christians and Yazidis when they fled Daesh's attack on them. Hundreds of thousands. And this is an example that is not often heard about, but it was actually very dramatic how a largely Muslim population gave refuge to Christians and Yazidis fleeing extremism of the so-called Islamic State. I can give many examples. In Syria, for instance, the towns and cities that have been destroyed by the war and by extremism particularly, Christians and Muslims are together rebuilding them. Like Malula, I showed you the picture of Malula. And there are many such examples. So I think working together is itself something that promotes harmony, because people then realize they can work together. In Kenya, Kenya is a Christian majority country, but Muslims and Christians have been participating in Kenya in what are known as Harambee projects, which are basically development projects in villages and small towns, doing it together. Going back to Egypt, the churches and Muslim organizations often run schools and hospitals together. So there are many examples that can be given.
Harim mentioned a word, and about that, Msgr. Yes, it's working, and that's also something that I would like Msgr to comment upon. Secularism. So we have different forms of secularism, very oppressive secularism like we have in France, for instance, like we had it in Turkey in Ataturk's time. We have one secularism which was envisioned in the Indian constitution and which has been forsaken for some reasons, known reasons. But there's a history to this term in Pakistan. It has been categorized as Ladiniyat, and then on the other side there are people who think this can be a solution. People like Etizaz Hassan, for instance, has been also in favor of adopting a term which is non-offensive, like inclusivity. So, if inclusivity, if not secularism, on the other hand, do you see a scope and do you see any manifestations, characteristics of more inclusiveness in the culture of Pakistan, in the society of Pakistan? Are those strengths still existing with us that can be used to rethink Pakistan or rebuild Pakistan on those lines of an inclusive democracy and inclusive society?
Yeah, this is a very important question. I mean, there are a number of answers that can be given for this. First of all, the first thing is that secularism is itself a system of belief. It's not neutrality. I mean, we can't say that secularism is something neutral and systems of belief are something else. It is itself a system of looking at the world and the human condition. I would say that for a country like Pakistan, there are two options. One was the option commended by Chief Justice Cornelius, the Christian Chief Justice of Pakistan, which was basically to identify elements in Islamic tradition that make for tolerance and freedom. So if you look at his written work, you will find that is what he's constantly commending Adal and Ahsan and so on as fundamental values that commend freedom. So this is why, I mean, he was a practicing Catholic, as you know, a daily mass goer, but he used to refer to himself as a constitutional Muslim. For this reason, that he felt that Islam had elements in it that could make for a free society, a free and a just society. That is one way to go, to identify those elements, and there's a long tradition from Shah Waliullah of Delhi, Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, Amir Ali Sayyid, Allama Iqbal himself, who have worked on this model. And of course, Dr. Fazlur Rahman himself. So there's a lot, there are many riches to call on to construct this kind of society. It's not just a slogan. The second way is what has been developed in Indonesia. I think Abraham was asking for examples. Now, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, population-wise, but it's not an Islamic state. It is a state built on Panchasila, the 5 principles that they have. But they have a very large organization called Nahadat al-Ulama al-Islam, millions of members, and they are commending politically for Indonesia what they call civic pluralism. That is to say, well, of course, in a country where there are about 200 million Muslims, Islam has to contribute in the political scene. But there's also a very large number of Christians, a very large number of Hindus, and a significant number of Buddhists in the country. And they should also make a contribution to the public sphere. I think this kind of civic plurality, where the state invites contributions from different religious traditions in proportion to their numbers and influence, would, I think, make for a healthy public space and for healthy public debate.
Well, this reminds me of an effort, Monsignor Michael by the government of Pakistan called Paigam-e-Pakistan. Uh, it, it didn't develop into very robust sort of initiative because of certain shortcomings. One that I know is that they ignored inclusion of minorities in the formation in the beginning. Although another program was started which was called Paigam Saiban, for instance, which was looking at minorities, religious freedom question. But then, of course, we have, some initiative in place and some initiatives that were, successful in a way in the past. And therefore, here we are to think more and to take some steps forward. I would like to thank Monsignor Michael for bringing us this world experience and a world picture to us this evening, to be able to take benefit from. This is because this is ThinkFest, about thinking and exploring and experimenting, exchange of ideas. And this because it's also a closing session of this ThinkFest 2023. Again, thank you so much, Monsignor, and thank you everyone. Thank you very much for being part of this discussion, your questions, and this discussion, of course, has to continue and enrich our basically perspectives and lives. Thank you so much.